Hey, what's up guys? And welcome back to another Reddit Stories video. Today, we are going to be getting into some mysterious Reddit stories. And these stories are great to listen to if you're studying, sleeping, relaxing, or just want to watch a mysterious and scary video. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you so much for stopping by. Hey, before we get into the video, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into some mysterious scary stories. There's a virus outbreak. It isn't like in the movies. If you're reading this, chances are you're as screwed as I am, or you're somewhere safe wondering how the world fell apart so quickly. Either way, I've got time, so I'll tell you everything. Before we start, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Liam. I'm 23, I used to work a dead-end retail job, and was a die-hard zombie fan. Yeah, one of those nerds who spends hours arguing online about whether slow zombies or fast zombies would be better in an apocalypse. I've watched every zombie movie, read every book, and even wrote fanfiction once. I thought I knew how it'd go if the world ever went to hell. I didn't. It's not like the movies. Not even close. There's no clear patient zero, no heroic scientist working on a cure, no group of survivors staying together to rebuild. It's worse. Way worse. It all started with plants. Or fungi. I don't remember. Before everything went to hell, life was fine. Not great, but fine. I'd wake up every day around 9 a.m. because my retail shift started at 11. My job sucked. Stacking shelves, cleaning up spills, dealing with rude customers, but it paid the bills. Barely. My apartment wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with leaky pipes and a fridge that made this awful humming noise, but it was home. I'd come back from work, crack open a beer, and watch whatever zombie movie or show was trending. I had a routine, you know? It wasn't exciting, but it was mine. I spent a lot of time online, mostly on forums and subreddits dedicated to zombie lore. I loved the debates. Could a zombie outbreak happen? What would be the best weapon? Which city would fall first? I was that guy who had it all planned out. My apocalypse survival kit was a mishmash of knives, canned food, and first aid supplies crammed into a duffel bag under my bed. It was half a joke, half serious preparation because, deep down, I wanted it to happen. Not in a people dying is fun kind of way, but in a finally, something interesting kind of way. The first time I heard about the bloom, it was on a random post on Reddit. Some guy uploaded blurry photos of these weird orange growths covering trees in a rainforest. The post didn't get much attention, just a handful of comments saying it looked like a bad case of fungal overgrowth. A few weeks later, it showed up in the news. Scientists were baffled by how fast it was spreading. They said it wasn't like any fungus they'd seen before. It consumed entire ecosystems and released spores that hung in the air like dust. I remember watching a segment on it during my lunch break at work. The anchors sounded concerned, but not panicked. It was happening far away, in some remote part of the world. So who cared? The first human cases popped up about a month later. That's when things got weird. The news showed footage of people in small villages near the outbreak zones acting strange. They moved sluggishly at first, then with sudden, violent bursts of energy. Their skin looked pale, almost translucent, with patches of bright orange spreading across their arms and necks. Officials called it a localized health crisis and assured everyone it was under control. But online, people were freaking out. Threads were dissecting every frame of footage, claiming it was the start of something big. Others laughed it off, saying it was just another overhyped virus like SARS or Ebola. I was skeptical and a little excited. This was the kind of thing I'd spent years obsessing over. I stayed up late reading every article, watching every video. I even joked with my coworkers about it. You ready for the zombie apocalypse? I'd ask, grinning like an idiot. They'd roll their eyes and tell me to get back to work. For once, my useless knowledge about fictional plagues felt relevant. But as the weeks went by, the news got darker. This localized health crisis wasn't so localized anymore. Cases started popping up in other countries, places far from the original outbreak. Entire towns were going silent. The footage became harder to watch, hospitals overflowing, soldiers patrolling empty streets, People with orange fungal patches covering their faces and arms, screaming and clawing at anyone nearby. The anchors stopped smiling. They didn't say it outright, but you could tell they were scared. I tried to keep my routine going. Wake up, work, do online stuff and sleep. But it got harder to ignore the growing sense of dread. Customers at the store started stocking up on canned goods and bottled water. Some whispered about getting out of town before it was too late. Others were skeptical, saying it was all media hype. I didn't know what to think. Part of me still wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it couldn't happen here. But another part of me, the part that spent hours debating survival strategies online, started to panic. Then one day, the panic became real. It was a Friday afternoon when the first infected person showed up in my town. Her name was Mrs. Dillard. She was a sweet old lady who always baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. According to her neighbors, she'd been feeling under the weather for a few days, but no one thought much of it. It was flu season, they said, so there was nothing to worry about. But when she wandered into the grocery store where I worked, it was clear something was very, very wrong. She looked off. Her skin was pale and patchy, her movements jerky. But what really got me was her eyes. God, her eyes. They were empty. Not like she was staring through you, but like there was nothing left inside. She collapsed near the cereal aisle, and all hell broke loose. My manager ran to help her, but before he could get close, she lunged at him. She bit right into his arm. I froze. It wasn't until she started changing that I realized how bad it was. Her skin split open, orange tendrils writhing out like vines. She wasn't human anymore. None of us knew what to do. Some people ran. Some tried to help. I just stood there like an idiot, staring. That was the last normal day in my town. The entire store was in chaos. My manager, bleeding and groaning on the floor, was turning and turning fast. Those orange tendrils? They grew out of him like weeds, wrapping around his arms and legs, pulsating like they had a heartbeat of their own. His screams were unlike anything I had ever heard. They were the kind that haunt your nightmares. People ran out of the store, knocking over displays and each other, desperately trying to escape. The ones who stayed, the brave or maybe just the foolish, tried to call for help. But cell service was already getting spotty. The lines were overloaded, or maybe something worse was happening. I don't know. I didn't leave right away. I couldn't. Part of me was frozen in fear, but another part was curious. I'd seen this kind of thing in movies 100 times, but this was real. Too real. The smell alone, a sickly sweet rot mixed with something sharp and chemical, was enough to make me gag. And the sounds? Wet, tearing noises as the tendrils ripped through clothing and flesh, cracking like dried twigs as bones bent in ways they weren't supposed to. It was horrifying, and I couldn't look away. When I finally snapped out of it, I grabbed my bag and ran. The streets outside were eerily quiet, but not for long. Word spreads fast in a small town, and it wasn't long before the panic set in. Sirens blared in the distance. Cars honked as people tried to flee, clogging up the main roads. I saw someone loading their entire family into the back of a pickup truck, kids crying as their parents shouted at each other. Another guy was throwing bags of groceries into his car like it was the last trip he'd ever make. Maybe it was. I went straight home, locked the door, and turned on the news. The footage was worse than anything I'd seen online. Entire neighborhoods were overrun, streets choked with bodies and fungal growths that glowed faintly in the dark. They showed soldiers in hazmat suits setting fire to buildings, shooting anyone who came too close, infected or not. The anchors kept repeating the same words: stay indoors. Do not attempt to leave. Help is on the way. Help wasn't on the way, at least that's what I thought. The next few hours were a blur. I'd like to say I was brave, that I sprang into action and started preparing for the worst. But the truth? I sat on my couch, clutching a baseball bat I'd grabbed from the closet, and stared at the TV. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family. Some were scared, others angry. A few were already talking about barricading themselves in or trying to leave town. I did my best to reassure my parents, who lived in another country, telling them everything was fine for now. What else could I say? By nightfall, the power went out. That's when the real fear set in. My apartment was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint orange glow outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw them. Infected, wandering the streets, their movements jerky and unnatural. Some of them, they were people I knew. Neighbors, co-workers, the guy who ran the diner down the street. All gone, replaced by these things. The bloom had taken them, and it was spreading fast. For the first few days, I stayed inside, living off whatever I had in the fridge and pantry. I could hear screams in the distance, gunshots, the occasional explosion. The infected didn't seem to care about day or night. They were always moving, always searching. Sometimes they'd stop and grow. That's the only way I can describe it. They'd collapse onto the ground, tendrils spreading out from their bodies like roots digging into the pavement. Within hours, those tendrils would sprout into these massive fungal blooms, releasing clouds of spores into the air. I wore a mask whenever I went near a window, but I knew it was probably pointless. After about a week, the government showed up. Or at least, that's what it looked like. Helicopters thundered overhead, their searchlights sweeping over the streets. Trucks rolled in, carrying soldiers in full tactical gear and hazmat suits. They set up checkpoints and barricades at every major intersection, their voices booming through loudspeakers. This area is under quarantine. Remain indoors. Help is on the way. For a brief moment, I felt hope. Real, tangible hope. Maybe they had a plan. Maybe they could stop this. But that hope didn't last long. The first thing they did was clear out the infected. Not by capturing them, not by trying to treat them. They killed them. All of them. I watched from my window as soldiers marched down my street, firing at anything that moved. The infected didn't stand a chance. Some tried to fight back, their tendrils lashing out, but the soldiers were relentless. The bullets tore through flesh and fungal growths, leaving the streets littered with bodies. At first, I thought they were doing their job, containing the outbreak, protecting the uninfected, and keeping things under control. It even gave me a sense of relief to see order being restored. But that feeling didn't last long. The soldiers weren't here to rescue people. They weren't knocking on doors to hand out supplies or ensure anyone's safety. They moved with mechanical precision, breaking down doors without warning, dragging people out regardless of whether they were infected or not. It was brutal and efficient, like they were following orders without a shred of humanity. They didn't announce themselves, knock, and wait for a response like I expected. No, these guys weren't there to save anyone. They were armed with rifles, flamethrowers, and explosives. If a house looked abandoned, they'd break in, sweep through every room, and mark it with an X. If they found anyone at all, they were dragged outside and taken to one of their quarantine zones. At first, people were hopeful. The soldiers promised safety, food, and medical care. They assured everyone that the infected were being handled and that anyone who showed no symptoms would be released after a thorough examination. But something didn't add up. People who were taken to the quarantine zones never came back. I noticed it first with the neighbors 2 doors down. The Petersons, a family of 4, mom, dad, and their 2 teenage sons. They were escorted out of their house one morning, looking scared but relieved to be in the hands of the military. The dad even waved at me as they left. Days passed, and I didn't see them return. Then weeks. Their house stayed empty, boarded up like all the others. I started paying closer attention. Every person the soldiers took, whether they were sick or perfectly healthy, just vanished, never to be seen again. No one came back with food or supplies. No one returned with stories of the quarantine zone's safety. It became clear, the zones weren't sanctuaries. They were something else entirely. I made up my mind to avoid the military at all costs. Staying in my apartment wasn't an option anymore. The soldiers were sweeping through buildings, and the infected were growing bolder. So I packed my bag and started moving, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. Every time I heard the rumble of a military vehicle or the bark of an order through a megaphone, I ducked out of sight. The soldiers weren't subtle. They moved in convoys of armored trucks and Humvees, their floodlights cutting through the darkness. They set up checkpoints at major intersections, forcing survivors to line up for inspections. Anyone who didn't comply was shot on sight. The rest were loaded onto trucks and driven to the quarantine zones. I overheard whispers from other survivors, those lucky enough to stay hidden like me. They talked about experiments, about people being used as test subjects for a cure. The idea made my skin crawl. Were they dissecting people? Injecting them with the virus to study its effects? The thought of ending up on one of those tables was enough to keep me moving. One night, I stumbled upon a group of survivors hiding in an abandoned warehouse. There were about a dozen of them, ranging from kids to elderly folks. They'd rigged up a decent shelter, with tarps hanging from the rafters and a small stash of supplies. They let me stay the night, though they made it clear they didn't trust strangers. Fair enough. Among the group was a girl about my age named Ellie. She had short, dark hair and a sharp wit that made her seem older than she was. At first, she kept her distance, just like everyone else. But over time, we started talking. It was mostly small stuff at first, where we'd been when the outbreak started, who we'd lost, what we missed most about the world before. She told me she'd been in college when the outbreak hit, studying biology. The one time knowing about fungi could have helped, and I was stuck in a dorm. She said with a bitter laugh. We started working together on supply runs. Ellie was quick on her feet and good at spotting danger before it became a problem. One time, we were scavenging a convenience store when we heard the telltale sound of an infected, that low, guttural growl that made your skin crawl. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the back room, holding a finger to her lips as we listened to it shuffle past. My heart was pounding, but Ellie stayed calm, her eyes scanning the room for another exit. When the coast was clear, she gave me a grin. I think that's when I started to like her. Over the weeks, Ellie and I grew closer. We'd sit up at night, talking quietly while the others slept. She told me about her little sister, who she hadn't seen since the outbreak started. I told her about my parents. Maybe they made it, she said, her voice soft. Martin, one of the older survivors, became a central figure in the group. He was a grizzled, pragmatic man who had a knack for fixing things. According to him, his friend worked in logistics for the quarantine zones. It's not what they're saying it is, Martin warned one night as we huddled around a makeshift heater. People aren't being cared for or cured. They're being studied and tested on. My buddy said the soldiers get orders to round up anyone they can, sick or not. And once you're in, you don't come out? His words sent a chill through the group. A few people argued, saying he was just trying to scare us, but deep down, I think we all knew he was telling the truth. The zones weren't about saving people. They were about control. For a while, life in the warehouse felt almost stable. We had a system. Martin and a few others reinforced the barricades and set up traps around the perimeter. Ellie and I continued going on supply runs, each trip bringing back just enough to keep us going. There were arguments, of course. Some people thought we should move, find a safer place, maybe head for the countryside. Others insisted that going outside was suicide, that the warehouse was as good as it got. One night, the tension boiled over. A man named Kevin, one of the more vocal advocates for staying put, got into a shouting match with Sarah, a woman who wanted to leave. You think it's bad here? Kevin snapped. Out there, it's a death sentence. You've seen what happens to the people the soldiers take. You want to walk into that? And what happens when the infected find us here? Sarah shot back. You think these barricades are going to hold forever? We're sitting ducks. Ellie and I exchanged a glance. We'd been having the same debate in whispers late at night. She was leaning toward leaving, while I was more hesitant. The thought of wandering into the unknown, with infected and soldiers around every corner, scared me. But staying put felt like a ticking time bomb. That night, Ellie and I snuck up to the roof again. The city stretched out before us, dark and silent except for the occasional flicker of movement far below. They're not wrong, you know, she said softly. We can't stay here forever. I know, I admitted. But where do we go? What's even left out there? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. I don't know, she said finally. But I'd rather die trying than wait for it to come to us. A week later, the infected found us. It started with the low, eerie groans echoing through the empty streets, followed by the sickly orange glow creeping along the edges of the warehouse. They came in waves, slamming against the barricades we'd set up. We fought back as best we could, but it was hopeless. There were too many of them and they were too fast. The group scattered, some trying to fight, others running for any exit they could find. Ellie and I stuck together, racing through the maze of corridors. We made it to a small room near the back of the warehouse and slammed the door shut behind us. The infected were pounding on the other side, their growls growing louder by the second. The room had 2 windows, one in the bathroom and one in the living area. I ran to the living room window and yanked it open, motioning for Ellie to follow. "Come on," I shouted, my voice shaking. She was right behind me, but as she reached the window, something grabbed her ankle. She screamed, her hands clawing at the frame as she tried to pull herself free. "Help me," she cried, her voice desperate. I froze. Every instinct told me to help her, to grab her arms and pull her through. But my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to save her. But I wasn't brave enough. Ellie's eyes locked onto mine, a mix of fear and betrayal flashing across her face. "Please," she screamed. I was angry at my own cowardice. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her through the window and prove to myself that I wasn't the kind of person who would abandon someone in their moment of need. But the weight of my own terror held me back. Her voice broke through again, louder this time, pleading. "Please, don't leave me." She reached for me, her fingers brushing against mine for the briefest moment, and then she was pulled back. I turned and leaped through the window, landing hard on the ground below. The impact sent a jolt of pain up my legs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, her cries grew fainter, swallowed by the growls and chaos. I ran into the darkness, and the image of her outstretched hand burned into my mind. The guilt was a weight I knew I'd carry for the rest of my life. The world blurred around me as I ran. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The warehouse and everything inside it, the chaos, the infected, Ellie's screams, faded into the distance. My heart pounded like a war drum, pushing me forward, away from the horror I had just escaped. The night was cold, but sweat soaked through my clothes. Every shadow felt alive, every noise was amplified. I didn't dare to look back. By the time I finally slowed, dawn was breaking over the horizon. I found myself on a desolate stretch of road leading out of town. The buildings thinned out until there was nothing but empty fields on either side of me. The silence was almost as oppressive as the chaos I'd just fled. It wasn't comforting, it was the kind of silence that felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. I collapsed on the side of the road, dropping my backpack and letting the cool morning air wash over me. My hands were trembling. Whether it was from exhaustion, fear, or guilt, I couldn't tell. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cracked asphalt beneath my feet. My mind replayed the scene over and over, Ellie's outstretched hand, her voice begging for help, the look in her eyes when I left her. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The memory was burned into my mind. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Sitting there wasn't going to do me any good. I took inventory of what I had managed to grab before fleeing the warehouse. A few cans of food, a half-empty water bottle, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. It wasn't much. Definitely not enough to last more than a couple of days. I had to keep moving. I knew cities were a death trap. Every zombie movie and survival guide I'd ever consumed told me that. Too many people meant too many infected. Supplies might be easier to find in urban areas, but the risk wasn't worth it. My best bet was to stick to smaller towns, scavenging what I could and staying under the radar. The open road stretched before me, and I started walking, my legs heavy but unwilling to stop. The first few days were simple. I stuck to back roads and avoided main highways, keeping an eye out for anything that moved. I raided a gas station along the way, picking up a few bags of chips and a couple of bottles of water. The place had already been ransacked, shelves overturned and glass shattered, but I managed to find a couple of overlooked items. The whole time, I kept my ears open for the low, guttural growls of the infected. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of wind through the broken windows made my pulse spike. Nights were the worst. I couldn't risk a fire, so I slept in the cold, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. Every shadow outside my makeshift shelter, whether it was an abandoned car or a collapsed barn, felt like a threat. I dreamed of the warehouse, of Ellie, of her screams. I'd wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat, the guilt sitting like a stone in my stomach. After nearly a week of traveling, I found myself in a place that could barely be called a town. It was more of a cluster of houses and a single convenience store. The sign at the edge of the road had been worn down by time and weather, leaving the name of the place illegible. Most of the buildings were in various states of disrepair, but there was no sign of the infected. It was quiet. I cautiously approached the convenience store, my knife in hand. The door was already ajar, hanging off one hinge, and the inside was a mess. Shelves were overturned, and the smell of rot lingered in the air. Still, I managed to find a couple of cans of beans and a bottle of soda. It wasn't much, but it would keep me going. As I stuffed the items into my backpack, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "You planning to pay for that?" a voice said from behind me. I spun around, my knife raised, and came face to face with Martin. He looked rougher than I remembered, his beard longer and his face lined with exhaustion. He was holding a shotgun, but it wasn't pointed at me. Instead, he leaned it casually against his shoulder, his expression wary but not hostile. "Martin?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Figured it was you," he replied. "You've got that same deer in the headlights look you had back at the warehouse?" Seeing him was like a punch to the gut. Part of me was relieved to find someone familiar, but another part of me wanted to run. Martin had always been sharp and observant. He'd see right through me, see the guilt written all over my face. "What are you doing here?" I asked, lowering the knife but keeping it in my hand. "Same as you, I'd guess. Looking for supplies. Trying to stay alive," he said. He gestured toward the door with his shotgun. "Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." We walked in silence for a while, sticking to the side streets and alleys. Martin didn't ask about Ellie, and I didn't talk about it either. The air between us was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Eventually, we found an abandoned house that looked sturdy enough to hole up in for the night. Martin took the first watch while I tried to get some sleep. The next morning, he finally brought it up. "Ellie didn't make it, did she?" he asked, his voice quiet. I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. "Oh, she didn't?" Martin didn't press me for details, but I could feel his judgment, even if he didn't say it out loud. I didn't blame him. I judged myself just as harshly. Over the next few weeks, we traveled together. Martin was resourceful, and his military background gave him an edge when it came to survival. He taught me how to set traps, how to find safe places to sleep, and how to stay hidden. We avoided cities and stuck to rural areas, scavenging what we could from abandoned farms and roadside diners. But the world wasn't getting any safer. The infected were spreading, and the military's presence was becoming more oppressive. We saw convoys of trucks filled with survivors heading toward the quarantine zones, their faces blank with fear. Martin's warnings about the zones echoed in my head. "Once you're in, you don't come out." And I believed him. One day, we came across a group of survivors hiding in an old church. They welcomed us cautiously, offering a place to rest and share a meal. Among them was a man who claimed to have escaped from one of the quarantine zones. His story was chilling. He described rows of cages, experiments that involved injecting people with the virus, and soldiers who treated the survivors like lab rats. "They're not trying to save anyone," he said, his voice shaking. "They're trying to understand the virus. To weaponize it." The news confirmed what Martin and I had suspected all along. The quarantine zones weren't sanctuaries, they were death traps. The only way to survive was to stay off the grid, to keep moving and avoid the military at all costs. But staying off the grid came with its own challenges. Supplies were running low, and every encounter with the infected was a gamble. If you are enjoying this story, kindly like this video and subscribe to the channel for other parts.